Okay, so this presentation is going to be on laws of nature, and in particular, what role laws of nature seem to play in scientific explanations and scientific predictions, and what fields of science, what areas of research within science make use of laws of nature, which ones don't, or which ones maybe don't, and what consequences that could potentially have for our understanding of those sciences. So this is a very quick little background. So coming out of the Enlightenment period, it was assumed that science is sort of giving us these reliable truths about nature, sort of the way nature really is, as compared to kind of the old authorities and old assumptions coming from the past. This new science was giving us finally the truth about nature. It was also understood that deductive reasoning, especially deductively sound arguments, are the very best kinds of arguments, the most reliable, in fact, 100% reliable, deductively sound arguments. And so it was assumed that science must somehow be using deductively sound arguments. If science is giving us completely reliable information, deductive reasoning is the completely reliable method of reasoning, so they must overlap. So here's an example. That's the argument that I just mentioned. So here's an example. So suppose we've got these starting conditions. An object with a mass of 1 kilogram is subjected to a force of 5 newtons. Newtons is just a unit of force. And then the second premise tells us that acceleration is equal to force divided by mass. So therefore, the prediction based on this starting conditions plus this second premise tells us that the object will accelerate at 5 meters per second squared. So this is a deductively valid argument. That is, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. But we can ask, is this a sound argument? We know it's valid, but in order to be sound, it has to be valid, plus the premises need to all be true. Well, that first premise, just sort of take my word for it that somehow the starting conditions are set up exactly in the way described in the first premise. The second premise, you might recognize that. That's actually Newton's second law of motion, sort of a reformulation, a restatement of Newton's second law of motion. So how do we know that that one's true? Well, scientists have worked on that for a long time, right? They tested that many, many, many different ways, lots of different kinds of ways from many different angles. So it seems like it's turned out to be correct just because we have so much evidence in favor of it. But even in that kind of a situation, we need to be worried about whether this is, as they call it in philosophy of science, a black swan scenario or black swan situation. So here's what we mean by that. It was assumed for a long time in Europe that all swans are white. That just is the case. It's just a truth about nature and about swans, that all swans are white. So assume these starting conditions, that the next bird I see is going to be a swan. Then all swans are white. So therefore, the next bird I see will be white. Well, that's a deductively valid argument. If those premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. But unlike Newton's law of motion, this second premise turned out to be wrong. Right? That once folks discovered, or folks from Europe discovered Australia, they saw some black swans. And so it was clear that that second premise is wrong. Well, so what's the difference between acceleration is equal to force divided by mass versus all swans are white? Well, both are these general statements about the way nature is, but the law of motion is a law, a capital L law of motion. The idea is that it's an exceptionless regularity. It is a truth, a true regularity about nature itself, that this will always work out, that acceleration is always equal to force divided by mass, just simply true. So therefore, the assumption then is that this is a deductively sound argument. Not only is it deductively valid, but it's deductively sound. Because unlike the all swans are white idea, this regularity about acceleration being equal to force divided by mass is a law of nature, so always true. Okay. Well, so that seems okay, I suppose, for what we have so far. But there's a potential problem here, that these capital L laws of nature tend to be found really only in physics, and then maybe also in chemistry, insofar as chemistry is really just sort of part of physics at this point. But there's a whole bunch of other areas of science, just about every other area of science, where these kinds of capital L exceptionless regularities, these capital L laws, don't seem to exist. So in biology, geology, ecology, psychology, economics, if we want to think of that as a science, all of these things have regularities, but they're regularities that sometimes work, or a lot of the times work, or most of the time they work. Uh, Historically, in the philosophy of science literature, these other fields of science beyond physics and maybe chemistry have come to be called the special sciences. And this is one of the reasons why they're called the special sciences, is because they don't seem to have laws of nature in the same way that physics has laws of nature. So this could lead us to this kind of a problem, right? This sort of argument. A law of nature is an exceptionless regularity. Regularities in the special sciences are not exceptionless. Therefore, regularities in the special sciences are not laws of nature. So the predictions or explanations coming from the special sciences are not deductively valid, and certainly not deductively sound, because they need to be deductively valid first in order to even have a chance of being deductively sound. So here's an example from ecology. Let's say that the population size of a predator, like wolves, is decreasing, right? So there's fewer and fewer wolves over the course of a year or two. Then the second premise tells us the regularity. Whenever a predator population decreases, the size of the associated prey population increases. So therefore, the size of the associated prey population will increase. This is a deductively valid argument. And you maybe, if you've taken an ecology class, you've seen a graph that looks a bit like this, where when the prey population goes up, then after a certain amount of lag time, the predator population follows up because they have more food. But then when the predator population starts to get too big, they eat too many of the prey, so the prey population is going down. But when the prey population goes down, then the predator population will follow it down because there's fewer things to eat, and so on. And so the predator and prey populations tend to follow each other in the way that this graph suggests. So this argument, right? The problem, of course, is that this regularity, which is a regularity from ecology that was shown in that graph, doesn't always work, right? It doesn't always work out as expected. And there's a ton of potential reasons. There could be a disease that's running through. There could have been a natural disaster of a variety of different kinds that's killing off everything. So when the predator population size is going down, well, so will the prey population size because of the natural disaster. Or there's an invasive species that's disrupting this relationship, or there's a huge number of different things. Some of them very plausible, but others rare, not very likely, but still possible. Maybe a meteor hit that area and wiped everything out. So there's all kinds of little details that could get in the way of that regularity. So that regularity doesn't count as a capital L law of nature. Just to give you a little flavor of things, you can pause here if you want to take a look at these. These are other regularities in different special sciences that are used and sort of followed by researchers in those special sciences, but they know that these things will not work out every time. There's all kinds of details that could disrupt these regularities. So what's our reaction to this? Well, Sandra Mitchell, who I showed you her essay right at the beginning, this is her essay that I'm basing most of this on, she suggests and explores a few different possible reactions to this. One would be that those special sciences, they just don't really count as proper sciences because they don't use deductively valid or deductively sound arguments to generate their predictions and their explanations. What are we to say about that? Well, if physics is the only real science, then what are those other things? We have to come up with some other word to refer to those. It seems like there's really good work being done. We get a lot of information, a lot of technology derived from those special sciences, a lot of problems solved. So if they're not sciences, then what are they, right? So it seems like this is not a very good option. So another option, though, is to say that, wait, the special sciences do in fact have laws of nature. They're just different kinds of laws. They're, as we'll see, they're called ceteris paribus laws. So this sort of fancy Latin name to them, and we'll see what that means in a moment. And the third response could be, and this is the one that Sandra Mitchell prefers, that these traditional laws of nature just aren't necessary for being a science. But before getting to that third one, let's look more at the second one. What the heck is this ceteris paribus law idea? So the phrase ceteris paribus can mean different things in different contexts. Here it means under standard conditions or all else being equal. So as long as there's nothing getting in the way of the regularity will happen. So the ceteris paribus clause, as they call it, contains all of the information that pertains to the things that could disrupt the regularity. So, the ceteris paribus clause would say something like, well, there's no natural disasters happening. There's no invasive species. There's no meteorite hitting the area. And then as long as all of those details are not sort of screwing up the regularity, then yes, we should see this predator-prey population relationship as expected. So we could modify the example of the argument we saw a moment ago. So first premise is the same, population size of a predator is decreasing. Now the second premise says ceteris paribus, that is all else being equal, as long as nothing else is getting in the way, as long as we're operating under standard conditions. Then whenever a predator population decreases, the size of the associated prey population increases. Then we can conclude that therefore, ceteris paribus, the size of the associated prey population will increase. So now we've got a deductively valid argument that is also deductively sound because we threw in this ceteris paribus clause to take care of all those details that could make the regularity work out wrong, right? Or block the regularity from actually happening as expected. We took care of all those. So now we've got a perfect regularity, right? It's true and exceptionless. As long as it's under standard conditions, then this regularity will work out. We can call it a law of nature. Here's another one, just again to get the flavor of it, right? So some DNA is being copied via standard replication. Then ceteris paribus, as long as nothing's getting in the way, as long as it's under standard conditions, as long as all the enzymes are working properly and so on, DNA replication results in two identical double-stranded DNA molecules. So therefore, ceteris paribus, this process will result in two identical double-stranded DNA molecules, right? So now the second premise counts as a law of nature because it's exceptionless. The ceteris paribus clause takes care of all the things that would cause an exception. So now this is an exceptionless regularity and it counts as a law of nature. What does it include? What does the ceteris paribus clause include? I mentioned some things. So any of the objects that are involved and sort of specifications of what needs to be the case for the objects that are involved in order for the regularity to work out properly, any of their interactions, any of the forces involved. If we're talking about DNA replication, things like pH is extremely important, as well as solute concentrations of various kinds, any of the moving parts involved, the temperature, the pressure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of the details are included in the ceteris paribus clause in order to ensure that we're to now have a law of nature. But once that's done, then these predictions or explanations coming from the special sciences are back to being deductively sound, and we can say that they're proper sciences again. We don't have these worries about them being somehow lesser sciences or just not even sciences at all. Okay, so that's what a ceteris paribus strategy is supposed to be here, what a ceteris paribus clause is in a ceteris paribus law. All right, well, Sandra Mitchell doesn't really like this strategy. As the name of her essay suggests, going back to the top here, ceteris paribus, an inadequate representation for biological contingency. So yeah, she does not think that this is an adequate strategy. So let's see why. Let's scroll down to where her thoughts begin on this. So the main concern, as I say here, is that the ceteris paribus clause, and maybe you are picking up on this already, but the ceteris paribus clause seems to contain just way too much information. Think of how many details need to be packed into that ceteris paribus clause in order to account for every detail that could get in the way of this proposed law of nature, this regularity from the special sciences. It could be that this list of details is effectively infinite, maybe actually infinite, or just so insanely long this list of details contained in the ceteris paribus clause is so insanely long that we could never really consider or think about them all. So it's kind of silly in a way to just say like, oh, ceteris paribus, and then that takes care of this list of details that nobody has ever been able to write out completely. The other thought is that the ceteris paribus clause is what we're actually interested in. Like, yeah, scientists are interested in regularities, but that's just sort of the beginning of scientific research. Once scientists notice kind of a rough regularity going on, whether it's in physics or in one of the special sciences, then they dive into the details and figure out, so why does this regularity work out? Under what conditions does the regularity go wrong or come out slightly differently? And that all that information is contained in the ceteris paribus clause. So to present sort of a scientific explanation or a scientific prediction by just sort of saying ceteris paribus, this certain thing works out, like, well, that's not very scientifically informative. If you asked a scientist for an explanation for why something happens, it doesn't make sense for them to just say, oh, well, that's a ceteris paribus law of nature. That's why that happens. That's not an explanation. You want the details. You want sort of all that information that's packed into that ceteris paribus clause, or at least a lot of it, the most relevant parts of it, so that you can get a flavor and a true understanding of what's going on here and why it's going on. Okay. So I kind of said a lot of this already. It contains, the very improbable factors even that need to be packed into that ceteris paribus clause. So it's just unmanageably large. The other thing is that this is related to the complaint that's already been registered against the ceteris paribus strategy here, is that just about anything could become a ceteris paribus law as long as you just put ceteris paribus in front of it. This ceteris paribus takes care of sort of all the details that need to be in place in order for a regularity to work out as expected. So I could say ceteris paribus, I get an A on every test. Bingo, law of nature. Right? It's like, yeah, like I was sort of a good student. I would tend to get A's on tests. Not always, but when I didn't get an A on the test, it was because I didn't study properly, or I wasn't aware of exactly what was going to be on the test, or I didn't get a good night's sleep, or there was something else distracting me, or all these other details that got in the way of me getting an A. Well, as long as none of those things are happening, then yeah, I get an A on every test. So ceteris paribus, I get an A on every test. That seems weird to call that a law of nature, but this ceteris paribus strategy on its own seems to suggest that that's okay. As long as I just say ceteris paribus, then this is a true exceptionless regularity of the universe, that I get an A on every test. So that casts some doubt as to whether this is a proper strategy for establishing regularities as laws of nature, or if this is in some sense kind of a cheating way of establishing a regularity as a law of nature. I said those already. So, well, calling something a law of nature, as we saw, helps with building deductively valid arguments and deductively sound arguments, the conclusion of which is a prediction about what's going to happen based on certain starting conditions. But why do we need to have deductively sound arguments in science at all? Well, like I said, that was sort of an assumption coming out of the Enlightenment that science must be using deductively sound reasoning. But if we abandon that, do we really lose what makes science good science? Doesn't seem like we really do. That we could say things like this, and this is what Mitchell suggests, that instead of assuming that we've either got exceptionless true capital L laws of nature or something other than reliable science, instead it seems like what science actually does is talk about sort of the range of reliability of the regularities that they're talking about in the special sciences in particular. So they might say things like this, that, well, we've got a certain regularity that we've observed, but there's so many ways that it can go wrong. Here's the list of ways that it can go wrong. So this is a regularity that holds just sometimes, or maybe it holds usually, right? But we can still expect it to go wrong a decent number of times. Or maybe it's a very reliable regularity. And so it's almost always. There's only rare cases where the regularity goes wrong. And in fact, when we learn more about contemporary physics, especially quantum mechanics, it seems like even this almost always kind of applies even in physics, that these standard capital L exceptionless laws of nature that we were talking about in physics maybe aren't exceptionless. That even in physics, under certain circumstances, say like near or inside of a black hole or near the beginning of the universe, like right at the Big Bang, that these laws of nature didn't hold. And then talking about quantum mechanics, any supposed laws are actually probabilistic laws. They don't give us a specific result that is the one result that we expect and predict based on certain starting conditions and some kind of law that's a regularity in quantum mechanics. No, it gives us a range of possibilities with a probability associated with each of those possibilities. So we're not talking about exceptionless laws of nature when we're dealing with quantum mechanics. So it could be that there just aren't any exceptionless regularities in nature. And so we can never construct reliably, deductively sound arguments to generate our predictions and our explanations in any of the sciences, not even physics. So there's no special complaint about the special sciences that they fail to have laws of nature, capital L, laws of nature, because no fields of science have capital L laws of nature. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Thanks for listening.